a small island in the San Francisco Bay. Its name would likely be unknown even to people living nearby, if not for the most famous prison in the world, Alcatraz. According to the official version, no one has ever successfully escaped from there. One more time, this is only according to the official version. The reality is not so simple. In mid-2022, American authorities realized composite sketches of three elderly men. These are believed to be what the men who escaped from the impregnable Alcatraz over half a century ago might look like today. Back then, three inmates devised an ingenious plan. They quietly led their cells, the prison building, and finally, the island it stands on. Since then, they have not been seen, or almost no one has seen them. For 60 years, evidence and witnesses have surfaced, indicating that the inmates were seen either in the United States or South America. For 60 years, American authorities have been searching for the escapees. However, they have not been found, neither alive nor dead. The case remains open. It is an incredibly captivating story. I will detail how three inmates managed to escape from one of the most secure prisons using spoons, raincoats, and harmonica, and most importantly, where the escapees disappeared to. This is the story of the escape from Alcatraz. Okay, I'm sure most of you have seen The Shawshank Redemption. It's a legendary escape story and, by the way, the most popular movie in film history, according to audiences. But that's not the point. The point is that this story is fiction. Stephen King wrote the novella, and a screenplay was later adapted from it. The characters are fictional, and any resemblance to reality is coincidental. Now imagine something like that happening in real life, except not just one person escaped, but three, and not from just any prison, but from Alcatraz, one of the most impregnable prisons in history, with the main mystery of the escape remaining unsolved from over half a century. This is the story I will examine in great detail, starting with this episode. June 12, 1962. This day in the Federal Supermax prison Alcatraz was supposed to start routinely. At 7 a.m., the guards conduct a cell check. By this time, every inmate is expected to be awake and standing by the bars to greet the inspecting officer. However, that morning, in one of the cells, the inmate was still lying in bed, tightly wrapped in blankets. The passing guard prodded his head through the bars with a baton, but there was no response. "I think he's dead," the officer said to a colleague, pushing the head harder. At that moment, the head fell to the floor of the cell. The guards quickly realized that the head was merely a dummy. Under the blankets, instead of a body, were rolled up sheets and cloths. A similar scene was found in two other cells. The standard procedure followed: an alarm, sirens, and the beginning of a search operation that would become unprecedented for America. It's no surprise. Three inmates had successfully escaped from Alcatraz, a prison from which escape was supposed to be impossible. This story began about a year before the actual escape in 1961. Alan West was an experienced thief and carjacker. However, he ended up in Alcatraz for a different reason. The inmate had escaped from other prisons several times, earning him a transfer to the legendary correctional facility known as The Rock. For several years in Alcatraz, West behaved well and earned the honorable right to paint the ceiling in the very building where his cell was located. Work in The Rock was considered a reward, not a punishment, but more on that later. During one of his shifts, West noticed a vent covered with a crate on the ceiling. It led directly to the roof of the building. That's when Alan came up with a plan to escape. To carry out such an ambitious idea, he needed a team. The best candidate for the job was an inmate named Frank Morris. By that time, he had made not one, not two, but a total of 11 escapes from prison. And all of this by the age of 30. Not bad, right? Morris grew up an orphan and was first arrested at the age of 14. The followed armed robberies, car thefts, burglaries, and break-ins. These were followed by prisons, from which Frank managed to escape largely due to his high intelligence. His file noted an IQ of 133, placing Morse in the elite club of the smartest people on the planet. Such a score and above are held by only 2% of people. Alcatraz was a natural end to such a biography. The prison authorities believed that he definitely wouldn't escape from here. The other two participants in the escape were brothers John and Clarence Anglin. They were not noted for high intellectual abilities, but they also ended up in Alcatraz after escaping from other prisons. So the team was assembled, but the participants' cells were in different parts of the building. For them to effectively coordinate their actions, they needed to be close to each other. A few months of good behavior and diligent work were enough. The future escapees were moved to cells next to each other. It's important to note that the cells in Alcatraz were solitary, small and cramped, but solitary. This was a significant advantage over other prisons, allowing inmates to sleep without fear for their lives. So Alan West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers received neighboring cells. This happened in September 1961. It was then that the inmates began preparing for the escape. Stage number 1. The plan. But wait, let's pause here. The prisoners were well aware of where they were, but I'm sure not all of you have that information. So, Stage 0. The introductory data. In 1775, a Spanish explorer discovered San Francisco Bay, including a small piece of land in the middle of the bay. The explorer named it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, or the Island of the Pelicans. At that time, the island was mainly populated by birds, not prisoners. In the mid-19th century, during the gold rush, American authorities built a fortress and a lighthouse on the rocky island. 10 years later, the Civil War began in the United States, and Alcatraz became a place of imprisonment for prisoners of war. But the island gained real fame only in 1934. By that time, the buildings had been remodeled and turned into a federal prison with maximum security measures and minimal chances of escape. The main purpose of Alcatraz was to hold especially dangerous criminals accused of murders, as well as those who escaped or broke rules in other correctional facilities. If you don't follow the laws of society, you end up in prison. If you don't follow the rules in prison, you end up in Alcatraz. In the 1930s, the main residents of Alcatraz were gangsters, with the most famous inmate of that period being Al Capone. It was in the 1930s that the strictest rules in the Rock were enforced, including an almost complete ban on inmates speaking to each other. In other prisons, Al Capone could negotiate fairly comfortable living conditions, but in Alcatraz, he, like everyone else, received a tiny solitary cell and strict discipline. Violations were met with punishments such as a complete ban on leaving one's tiny cell. Some prisoners claimed that were beaten, although the prison authorities predictably denied this. By the 1960s, gangsters were no longer a societal problem, and the conditions in Alcatraz were somewhat relaxed. However, the security measures remained reliable and were even modernized. Firstly, the prison was located on an island. The nearest land was about 1.5 kilometers of cold waters in San Francisco Bay. You could try to swim, but it would most likely end in severe hypothermia, and the person would simply drown. However, you might not even get that far. As the bay is full of sharks, it is possible to cross by boat, but where would you get one? All vessels, except for official ones, were prohibited from approaching Alcatraz closer than 200 meters. The island was surrounded by barbed wire fences and several guard towers with snipers. However, all these was likely irrelevant because escaping from the main building, where the inmates were held, was nearly impossible. The number of inmates on the island was always small, around a couple of hundred. There was one guard for every 3 inmates, the best ratio compared to other American prisons. The staff conducted multiple daily counts of the prisoners. The cells were located on 3 floors, facing each other, so that the guards could better see what was happening behind the bars on both sides. In the center were rooms with armed personnel. From the position, they could potentially shoot through the entire interior of the prison. The main building also had metal detectors and canisters of tear gas in case of a riot. And the most compelling evidence of Alcatraz's impregnability was the 14 escape attempts, all of which failed. More precisely, all but the one that this story is about. So Alan West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers began preparing for the escape in September 1961. The accomplices needed to solve 4 problems: how to get out of the cell, how to leave the prison building, how to get down to the water unnoticed, and how to reach the mainland. The first problem was the cell. Cutting through the sturdy bars was not futile, but also pointless, as armed guards would be waiting behind them. The other option was to dig a tunnel through the wall. Under the sinks in the cells, there was a vent. Behind it was a passage that led to a narrow corridor with pipes and other utilities. The bad news was that the ventilation opening was too narrow for a person to fit through. The good news was that the cement around the perimeter was not very strong, and the accomplices decided they could try to break it. The escapees stole spoons from the dining hall, sharpened them to a point, and began systematically chipping away at the wall around the ventilation opening. They worked in shifts, with 2 watching for guards patrolling the corridor, while the other 2 scraped away the cement in their cells. The protagonist of the movie, The Shawshank Redemption, took decades to create a hole in his cell. The inmates of Alcatraz were much luckier. It took them only 6 months. During this time, they gained access to the corridor with utilities behind the cell. Clarence Anglin was the first of the accomplices to do this. Through the corridor with pipes, he reached the coveted ventilation opening at the very top of the building. It seemed that freedom was very close, but at that moment, Anglin realized that the ventilation opening was not just covered by a grate. The grate was securely fixed with large bolts. The escapees decided to solve these bolts. However, that's easier said than done. Firstly, the absence of inmates in the cells would be quickly noticed by the guards. Secondly, the accomplices working on the bolts could easily be seen and heard. But don't forget, Frank Morris is an escape artist, and his escapes are not just escapes, they are masterpieces. The greatest of which was, of course, this one. Here's what I mean. To prevent the guards from noticing the absence of people in the cells while they sawed off the bolts under the roof, the inmates made dummy heads. They used any materials they could get their hands on during their work. Pieces of cloth, paper, soap, wire, cement, and glue. The escapees created dummy heads. For realism, they needed 2 more things: paint and hair. Inmates at Alcatraz had not only duties but also rights, including the right to hobbies. So the accomplices requested paint from the administration under the pretext of painting portraits of their loved ones. The material, of course, went to paint the dummy heads. The finishing touch was the hair. Clarence Anglin worked in the prison barber shop, where he managed to obtain hair, which the escapees glued to the dummy heads. The inmates placed cloths and sheets under the blanket, with the head on top, creating a very realistic image of a sleeping person. If you didn't get too close or touch it, it was almost impossible to detect the deception. Another important detail that the escapees successfully addressed was the wall in the cells. To prevent the guards from noticing that a section under the sink was missing, the inmates made a dummy wall out of cardboard and painted it in a similar color. So the problem of the absence of inmates in the cell was solved. The next step was cutting the bolts on the ventilation. As you've already understood, one of the main reasons for the operation's success was the inmates' work assignments. If you misbehaved, you could be locked in solitary confinement for a long time. Alan West, for example, was painting the ceiling of the building in the very space above the upper level of the cells. Due to the painting, debris accumulated in the space under the ceiling. West decided to sweep some of the debris down. Because of the building's design, the debris fell straight down into the main corridor. This corridor was called Broadway, and the shiny floor of this Broadway was a particular point of pride for the prison administration. When the guards complained, West shrugged, pointing out that painting is a dirty job, and immediately suggested a solution. They should just cover the space under the ceiling with pieces of cloth, keeping Broadway clean. The guards agreed, and Alan West and the escapees achieved their goal. Now, no one would see them cutting the bolts. However, they could still be heard, as cutting silently is quite difficult. It's worth noting again that the reputation of Alcatraz was much scarier than the actual conditions in the prison. Firstly, the inmates were well fed to prevent hunger strikes. But even more interesting was the tradition of music hours. Almost every day from 5:30 to 7 p.m., there was a music hour. Inmates could sit in their cells and play instruments or listen to the radio. For example, Al Capone played the banjo quite well, as the story goes. The sounds of music provided a perfect cover for the escapists' work. They took turns accessing the ventilation opening and gradually sawed through the massive bolts. In this small space under the ceiling, which was by then tightly covered with cloths, the escapees set up a real workshop. The last stage of preparation was the boat. The inmates planned to cross San Francisco Bay and reach the mainland. According to one version, Frank Morris, the one with the high IQ, enjoyed reading Popular Mechanics magazine in his cell. He came across an interesting article, How to Make a Life Vest from a Raincoat. And here an important detail needs to be explained. The weather in San Francisco Bay leaves much to be desired, primarily due to heavy rains, which occur frequently. Raincoats were an essential part of the inmates' wardrobe in Alcatraz, and these were in plastic bags with armholes. They were made from sturdy, reliable material. The prison administration didn't keep a strict inventory of this item of clothing, so the accomplices easily used not only their own raincoats, but also borrowed others from fellow inmates. They managed to gather several dozen in total. And here's another important detail. Many inmates were aware of the planned escape. The cells in Alcatraz are opposite each other, and it was impossible to cut the wall unnoticed for 6 months. Yet none of the inmates betrayed the would-be escapees to the guards. In that very improvised workshop under the ceiling, the escapees made life vests and an inflatable boat out of raincoats. Their experience working in sewing workshops in various prisons came in handy like never before. Although the working conditions were far from ideal, the accomplices used threads, glue, and heat to make life vests and a boat. They also created paddles from found wooden boards. 9 months after the preparation began, Alan West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers were ready to escape. The show started on June 11, 1962. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the lights went out in Alcatraz. The following day at 7 in the morning, a routine check was scheduled to begin. The accomplices had less than 10 hours to complete the escape. At the very first stage, one inmate dropped out. That was Alan West, who came up with the idea of escaping through the ventilation opening, and he remained in his cell. It's still not entirely clear what the reason was. He claimed that he had overdone it when cementing the fake plug in the wall, and at the critical moment, he simply couldn't remove it. There is a theory that he got scared, which is quite logical. None of the 3,000 people who previously tried to escape from Alcatraz succeeded. Most of them were caught, 6 were killed, and several drowned. There is also a third version, that West was abandoned by his accomplices. Why this might have happened and which version is true remains unknown to this day. The escapees were reduced to 3, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. They crawled out of their cells, made their way up to the ventilation opening, and pushed the pre-sawed heavy crate onto the roof. According to several witnesses who were serving time in Alcatraz at that moment, they heard the sound of heavy object falling onto the roof that night. The inmates then began making noise intentionally to distract the prison guards. Whether this act of solidarity really took place or if it's just a beautiful legend remains unclear. What is certain is that the escapees managed to get onto the roof of the building unnoticed. They had with their life vests, a boat, pedals, and a harmonica. The most perceptive among you might have already guessed what the harmonica was for. The rest we'll find out shortly. At Alcatraz, they paid close attention to gastronomy, so there was a separate bakery on the first floor, and a pipe from it went out to the top of the building. It was down this pipe that the inmates descended. Despite the presence of watchtowers with guards, the escapees managed to reach the barbed wire fence surrounding the island unnoticed. The trio threw cloths over the wire and safely climbed over to the other side. Then they made their way down to the water on the northwest side of the island. This is where the harmonica came into play. They used it to inflate the boat and the life vests. Taking the paddles in hand, Frank Morris, John, and Clarence Anglin began rowing. Behind them, they left the most impregnable prison in America. What happened in Alcatraz the morning after the escape is already known to you. Dismayed guards, the alarm signal, the dummy heads. The prison administration began a search. It quickly became clear that the escapees were not on the island. After this, the FBI took over the case. They involved the Coast Guard and all police stations located nearby on the mainland. These actions indicated one thing. The authorities were seriously considering the possibility that the escapees had successfully crossed the bay and were on the run. The primary evidence became the escapees' cells, their improvised workshop under the ceiling, and Allen West. During interrogations, he revealed details of the escape preparation. Gradually, the FBI and prison administration pieced together what had happened. However, this still did not answer the main question. Where did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers disappear to? Within 3 days after the escape, the police found several clues. About a kilometer from Alcatraz, a bundle containing photos and notes belonging to the Anglin brothers was found in the water. Additionally, a paddle was found near the neighboring, matching another paddle left by the escapees in their workshop under the roof. Finally, after 3 days, a life vest was found on a beach far from Alcatraz. It matched the vest left with Allen West. The police visited the homes of all the escapees' relatives and close acquaintances. All of them stated that they hadn't seen the inmates and hadn't received any messages from them. The Anglin brothers' mother told the police that she hadn't seen her sons, and even if she had, she wouldn't have told the police. Surveillance was established on all of the escapees' relatives. This continued for nearly 20 years. Over these years, investigators were unable to find any of the 3 escapees. In 1979, the FBI closed all cases related to the Alcatraz escape. In almost 20 years, they managed to reconstruct the actions of the accomplices a year before the escape and on that fateful night in June 1962. In short, they knew almost everything I've mentioned earlier. However, the main question remained unanswered. What happened to the 3 escapees after they left the shore of Alcatraz Island? Did they manage to cross the San Francisco Bay, or did they drown? The bodies were never found, and no one saw the inmates alive. The FBI agents concluded the investigation with only a set of theories and assumptions, most of which raise questions. But let's go through it all in order. The FBI website has a small article dedicated to the history of the Alcatraz escape. At the end, several reasons are given why, according to law enforcement, the escapees could not have reached the mainland and drowned. The first and main argument is that the escapees physically could not swim across the San Francisco Bay because of sharks, currents, and the cold water. On one hand, this version sounds logical. The 4th participant in the escape, Allen West, stated that the escapees' target was Angel Island, where there was a semi-abandoned military base. The escapees supposedly planned to reach there first. There were very few military personnel on the island, so the likelihood of being noticed and reported to the police was low. From there, the accomplices planned to make their way to the mainland. According to investigators, the situation on the night of the escape was as follows. Due to strong winds, the escapees were being pushed towards the ocean, and at some point, they realized they couldn't row to Angel Island. They then abandoned everything and tried to swim to Angel Island. However, hypothermia quickly set in, and the weakened escapees drowned. This theory is supported by the bundle of photos and the paddle found nearby. However, this picture is disrupted by several details. The first is the myth about sharks. One of the scary stories about Alcatraz was that the waters of the bay were full of great white sharks, those from the movie Jaws, which are known to eat people. In reality, there are sharks in the bay, but their numbers are greatly exaggerated, and they are not great white sharks. The species present in the bay are not interested in humans. To present an objective picture, it's worth noting that there have been recorded instances of great white sharks appearing in San Francisco Bay, but in the past half century, these occurrences can be counted on the fingers of one hand. The next myth concerns the cold waters of the bay and strong currents. For several decades, triathlon competitions have been held in these waters. One of the stages involves swimming from Alcatraz Island to the mainland. Every year, dozens, if not hundreds, of participants swim through those very cold waters with strong currents. The average water temperature in the bay is about 12 to 15 degrees Celsius. It's not warm, of course, but it is possible to last a couple of hours in the water. Incidentally, in the last 40 years, no participant in these swims has been harmed by sharks, so theoretically, the escapees could have reached their destination even by swimming. But it's not that simple. The showers in Alcatraz had hot water, not to create a more comfortable atmosphere, but to prevent the inmates' bodies from adapting to cold water. There was also no swimming pool in Alcatraz. It's one thing when prepared athletes cross the bay in broad daylight under supervision. It's quite another for unconditioned escapees in poor physical shape attempting the crossing in the middle of the night. An example of this is an escape that occurred at Alcatraz 6 months later. At the end of 1962, an inmate named John Scott escaped from the prison kitchen, ran to the water, and started swimming. He managed to cover 2 kilometers to the San Francisco Bridge. However, he was so exhausted and weakened that he collapsed unconscious on the shore, where he was captured by the police. Additional evidence suggesting that the escapees drowned includes indirect evidence. Over nearly 20 years of investigation and surveillance of their relatives, the FBI found no significant evidence that the inmates were alive or had somehow made contact. However, the bodies were never found, so the case couldn't be legally closed. In 1979, responsibility for the case was transferred to the U.S. Marshals Service, primarily responsible for tracking down criminals. Over the last 40 years, many new details about the fate of the Alcatraz escapees have emerged. Some of these details suggest that the inmates not only survived but also managed to leave the country undetected. In the early 2000s, the hosts of the popular show Mythbusters decided to recreate the escape route from Alcatraz. They used similar raincoats, threads, and glue to construct a homemade boat. They inflated it using an accordion and attempted to pedal from Alcatraz to Angel Island. They succeeded, with one minor correction. The strong current carried them towards the ocean, and instead of Angel Island, the hosts landed somewhere near the Golden Gate Bridge. This might have been what happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers on the night in June 1962. After the investigation was handed over from the FBI to the U.S. Marshals, a couple of unexpected documents surfaced. Officially, the escapee's boat was never found. However, those documents recorded that the homemade boat was indeed found on a beach on Angel Island. Moreover, there were tracks leading away from it, left by several individuals. The same document mentioned another curious fact. After the escape in 1962, police in neighboring areas closely monitored reports of stolen vehicles. The escapees would have needed some way to travel. Officially, no such thefts were reported. However, the documents mentioning the found boat also included notes about a missing vehicle. Why these documents only surfaced 20 years after the FBI's investigation ended, and why the boat was not listed among the evidence, remains unclear. There are reasons to doubt the authenticity of these materials. The story of the missing documents only came to light in one documentary film by the History Channel. Other sources merely referred to the same film. Furthermore, the fact that the escapees' boat was found on Angel Island is highly doubtful, as the strong current would have carried them towards the mainland, as proven by the Mythbusters. The story of the Alcatraz escape was very sensational. In 1962, the police received a flood of calls and reports claiming the escapees had been seen in various places, but none of these reports were confirmed. Many years later, the U.S. Marshals Service received an interesting letter. The author claimed that a relative of his gave the escapees a ride in 1962 near San Francisco and ended up shooting them. The letter even provided exact coordinates where the bodies were supposedly buried. When the police arrived and started digging, nothing was found. The relatives of the escapees, particularly the Anglin brothers' family, claimed to have received letters and gifts from the missing brothers over a long period. It seemed that the handwriting matched that of John and Clarence Anglin. However, the letters were undated, making it impossible to prove they were written after the escape. It's quite possible that the Anglin's relatives made up stories about the letters. In the mid-1970s, this photo was taken in Brazil. The photographer claimed it showed the Anglin brothers, who had supposedly escaped to South America and started a farm. While some experts acknowledged the resemblance of the people in the photo to the brothers, the image quality didn't allow for a definitive identification. Moreover, the photographer was a man named Brizzi, a professional con artist, making him an unreliable source of information. As in any mysterious story without a clear answer, conspiracy theories emerged. Less than a year after the escape, the Alcatraz prison was closed. Due to its location, it was very expensive to maintain. The whole escape story was supposedly fabricated to justify the closure. Therefore, it's not surprising that the escapees' whereabouts might be hidden even if known to the authorities. There is no substantial evidence in the form of documents or witnesses to support this theory, but its emergence is quite natural. 60 years after the escape from Alcatraz, neither the FBI, nor the US Marshals, nor the general public knows for sure what happened on that June night in 1962. In this story, there is one argument that I consider the most convincing. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were professional criminals. Each of them had multiple arrests. After being released, they quickly committed another crime and ended up back in prison. For them, it was a second home. It's hard to imagine that the escapees lived a quiet life on a farm for 60 years without attracting the attention of the FBI or the police. Most likely, the inmates did drown. However, there are no bodies and the escapees haven't been found alive either. The Marshal Service is legally required to continue the search until the last of the escapees turns 100 years old. This deadline expires in 2030. The story of the Alcatraz escape remains contentious. For every argument, there is an equally compelling counter-argument. That's why many still believe that Frank Morris, John, and Clarence Anglin managed to cross the San Francisco Bay and disappear. At the very least, many people want to believe it.